Welcome back everyone, and in today's video lesson we are going to look at augmented and diminished intervals. Let's do a really quick recap. So augmented intervals basically just mean to make them larger. So we take an interval, whatever it might be, and we make it larger. For a diminished interval, it's going to be the inverse of that idea, and we're going to make it smaller. So I have below here the C major scale and the C minor scale. And if I were to write out scale degrees on these, then this would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And the important thing to remember here is that our threes are different kinds of threes. They have the same general interval, but they have different specific intervals. The general interval here is a third when I compare it from C, right? Because everything is always referenced to our root. And they have the same general interval, they're thirds, but they have different specific intervals. It's obviously C to E, which is not the same thing as C to E flat. So the specific intervals are different. And obviously this is going to be the same story with A and A flat and B flat. The important part of the story here, though, is that as long as it's some kind of an E, it's going to be a 3. So in the key of C major, if I had an E flat, an E, or an E sharp, these are all going to be some kind of a 3. Likewise, if I had some kind of an A flat, or an A sharp, those are all going to be some kind of 6. So that's sort of the idea. That's what we're going to be working with here. Let's go and move on down to the example. Now, if we take a look at this example here, we have C to D. So C would be our perfect 1, D would be a major second, and E is going to be a major third. Now let's look at the notes in between. Something like this. And we know from previous videos that this is now minor second, and this is going to be minor third. But something I want to think about is, well, what about, let's say, this note? D flat is the same thing as C sharp. So what would I call this note? Well, what I want to think about is C and C sharp. They have the same bass note. Do you see how they're both C's? Right? It wasn't C and D anymore, it's C and C sharp. So this is going to be considered augmented 1. And let's think about why that is. Well, it's going to be a 1 because it has the same bass note. It's still some kind of a C, just like our example of here. It doesn't matter what kind of E it was, E flat, E, E sharp, A flat, A sharp, it was still that same degree. Same story here. This is a C, this is a C sharp, doesn't matter. They're different C's, but it's still going to be a 1 because this is a 1. Why is it augmented? Well, I want you to imagine for a moment that all these have naturals, invisible naturals on them. So we can see that this is getting larger from this natural to this sharp is getting larger. And that is by definition what the augmented interval does. It makes something larger. Now let's look at the inverse of that idea. What happens if I were to make D flat smaller? This is maybe a little bit trickier to think of, but it turns out I can still do the same thing. I can call C natural, C, I can call that note, how about I call it D flat, flat. So it's a D double flat. That certainly works. A D double flat would also be the same thing as a C natural. And that, in turn, would be, well, I'm making something smaller now, right? So that's going to be a diminished second. And hopefully you see why, because D something is the second degree, and I'm making it smaller, so it has to be, actually I put this in the wrong spot, so it has to be a diminished second. This is a diminished second. This is an augmented 1. Let's take a look at one more example over here on this part. And we have from a major second to a minor third. And if I wanted to think about going up from the major second, so this is D. And if I augment that interval, I'm going to end up with D sharp. It's now larger, right? D sharp is larger than D. So I've augmented it. It's certainly not the same thing as an E flat. It is enharmonic to E flat. It's not the same scale degree. So this is why it has to be an augmented interval, because a D here, D something and a D something. So they're both some kind of a 2. So this would make it an augmented 2. Likewise, I could take an E flat and flat it again to go backwards, E flat, flat, and that would give me a diminished third. And the thing that you should really think about here is that a diminished second is the same thing as a P1. A diminished third is the same thing as a major second. An augmented 1 is the same thing as a minor second. And an augmented 2 is the same thing as a minor third. Okay, and there's a lot more examples like this. But even though they're the same thing, we still have distinctions about. So let's take a look at this. With respect to C major, I have all the intervals sort of laid out here. And if I go through this, I'll try to do it very quickly. Let's see, this would be A4, and this would be D5. Okay, and another way that I could write out D flat, I could also call it C sharp. I could call this D sharp. I could call this E sharp. I could call this G sharp. I could call this A sharp. And I could call this B sharp. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at what else I could also call C, D flat, flat. I could also call E, F flat. I could also call D, E flat, flat. I could call G, A flat, flat. I could call B, C flat, and so on and so forth. So you kind of get the idea. Okay, so these are going to be the augmented and diminished intervals. So hopefully you can see, what would I call this one? Well, these are the same degrees. These are C and C sharp. So there's some kind of a C, some kind of a 1. It's getting bigger, so we're going to call it A1, augmented 1. Here, these are the same degrees, but it's bigger, so we're going to call it augmented 2. And here we can see these are the same degrees, but it's getting bigger, so we're going to call that augmented 3. Here we can see these are the same degrees, but it's getting bigger, so we're going to call that augmented 5. Here, these are the same degrees, it's getting bigger, we're going to call that augmented 6. Here, these are the same degrees, but it's getting bigger, so we're going to call that augmented 7. So we have augmented 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, and 7, and this is actually A4. Now on this side, we have the exact same kind of idea in the opposite direction. We have D flat going down to D flat, flat. I can see that it's getting smaller, so this is going to be a diminished 2. Here, this is getting smaller. This is going to be a D3. Here, this is getting smaller, so this is going to be a diminished 4th. Here, this is getting smaller from A flat to A double flat. This is going to be a diminished 6th. We have our diminished 5 here. Here, this is getting smaller from C to C flat, and this is going to be our diminished 8. And let's see, I did miss one. We are going to look at this one as, make sure I get the right color, B flat, flat, and we would call that one our diminished. Well, let's see, from here to here, we're getting smaller from B flat. B flat is some kind of a 7, so this is going to be a diminished 7. Finally, looking at A major, we would have the same thing. And maybe you can try this one on your own and see if you can figure out what the answer would be. But I'll run through it fairly quickly. And if we were to do something, we would have something like this. Notice that I'm just basically flipping everything. That's going to be a C double sharp. F double sharp, G double sharp, B double flat, C flat, D flat. We already have our E flat, F flat, G flat, and A flat. And so down below, these are going to be our diminished intervals, and these are going to be our augmented intervals. So very quickly, this would be A1, this would be A. In fact, these are all going to be A's, right? So we'll just run through those. So this is A1, and now here we have A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, A7. Now down below, this is D2, D3, D4, D5, D6, D7, and D8. And those are augmented and diminished intervals.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you've really enjoyed what you've seen so far, please just go ahead and click that subscribe button for me. It'll help keep us going so we can put out more great content for you.